Welcome Agilists, and let's talk about the 3 C's and how you can use them to make your user stories consistent within your product backlogs. So if you've been working in an agile environment for any amount of time, then you've probably had some exposure to some kind of team board. It could be a physical board when you go into work, where user story cards are actually written physically, like on large cards or large post-its. You could be working in a productivity software like Jira or Trello, where they essentially have their own kind of frameworks that you can input your user story details into. So given that we've got all of these kind of different approaches or different ways that you can approach user stories, how do we get one really clear and consistent approach to how our user stories and requirements are drafted when they actually reach the product backlog? Enter the 3 C's. So the 3 C's are an agile method to ensure that you have a consistent approach to the way that your user story cards are drafted. The 3 C's consist of 3 parts, which are card, conversation, and confirmation. And if you include these 3 parts, then you should have really strong agile user stories that actually deliver value back to the business and back to whatever project or product that you're working in. So your first C, as we identified, is a user story card. Now your user story card really essentially is, first of all, your user story, and your user story should follow that traditional user story format. And the reason that we draft the requirements using the as a I want to so that I format is because it very clearly identifies, first of all, who the user is, secondly, what the requirement is, and finally, what the value or the benefit it's returning to the user or returning to the businesses. And that value or benefit part really is key, because that's what makes a user story stand out from a normal requirement. Now, the other part of the user story card is the content itself. And this is where you provide kind of pre-development conversation, so to speak, and content. And this is where you can include things like your non-functional and functional requirements. So to give an example, let's say your user story is, as a email user, I want to send an email so that I can communicate with the business effectively or communicate with people within the business. Okay, so that's quite a clear, simple user story that I think we can all understand. Now within that user story card itself, you'd have the user story, but then you might have some more content. It might be in regards to things like compatibility. It might be non-functional requirements, such as it needs to send in under 2 seconds, without going into too much detail. But this is where we can actually just provide a bit more information, a bit more content about what the product needs to do. Our next C is conversation. Really, conversation is all about transparency. Working in an agile environment, you know that transparency is one of our core values, and it's really important that as a Scrum Master or product owner or any other stakeholder, I can dip into that project or dip into that product or backlog at any moment in time and know the state of that requirement, know the state of that user story. So it's really important that your developers know, but even you know as a product owner or a Scrum Master, that if something needs to be updated within that user story, it's updated immediately so that people can see the progress that's been made on that. This allows for, obviously, you know, if the worst case scenario and a developer has to drop it or leaves or is not available towards the end of a sprint, that someone else could pick it up because the level of detail in the conversation is enough for them to be able to continue with the work, even in the absence of the person that perhaps is the owner of that card at that moment. Our final C is confirmation. Now, confirmation really has 2 parts. On the first part, we have our acceptance criteria as drafted by the product owner. So the acceptance criteria by the product owner really is normally going to be user or business driven. So we normally use BDD scenarios or behavior driven development. And this is when we draft a scenario using that kind of given, when, then format. So going back to our example where we said, as an email user, I want to send emails so that I can communicate effectively with the business, or whatever it was worded exactly. We could go back to that now and test against that to make sure that that's actually done effectively. So we could say, given I have logged in, when I send an email, the email is received by the recipient. Okay, now where this is quite powerful is that we're actually testing against the value that we set We're not just saying, oh, I can send an email, it's done. No, when the actual developers working on this, they know that not only do they have to test that it's sent, but also need to test it's been received, because receiving the email was a part of the value that we were going to return as a part of this requirement. The other element of confirmation that we can use is test criteria. And test criteria is something that really should be drafted by your test engineer or your solution tester or your lead QA or whoever it is, or one of the QAs in the team. Basically, the people who provide that testing expertise to your team. You want them to have input because they're going to identify things such as fringe cases. They might think about things like regression testing, and they might think about things like compatibility. All of these things that perhaps developers and obviously product owners aren't going to think about maybe when they're drafting their user story cards. So this is when they bring their test expertise to draft test criteria to ensure that the product is robustly tested before it's considered done. Now, obviously, all of this is going to depend on what the definition of done you've established is. So those are your 3 C's: card, conversation, and confirmation. If they're used effectively, they can ensure that you return value, they ensure that you work in iterative feedback loops, and they also ensure that you deliver working software back to the business.